The fangless diplomat. The shuttle door opened with a hiss, and Commander Alara Vance stepped onto the landing platform of Kethros. Primed for the first time in her life, she had studied the Viraki for 3 years before this assignment, and she thought she was ready for what she would see, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of standing among them. They were massive creatures, each one standing at least 8 feet tall, with bodies covered in sleek black fur that seemed to absorb the light around them, and their mouths were filled with curved fangs that gleamed like polished knives, and their claws looked like they could tear through metal without any effort at all. The welcoming delegation stood in a half-circle around the landing pad, and Alara counted 12 of them, all wearing the crimson sashes of the warrior caste, and all of them were staring at her with expressions she could not quite read for a long moment. Nobody spoke, and the only sound was the wind howling across the platform and the distant rumble of the city below. Then one of the Viraki stepped forward, and Alara recognized him from the briefing files as Warlord Kethon, the military governor of the entire planet and one of the most powerful beings in the Dominion. He was older than the others, his muzzle streaked with gray, but his eyes were sharp and cold and full of something that looked very much like contempt. "This is what the humans send us," he said, and his voice was deep and rough like stones grinding together. He walked in a slow circle around Alara, looking her up and down as if she were livestock at a market, and she stood very still and kept her face calm even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "No claws," Kethon observed, lifting one of her hands and examining her fingers with obvious disgust before dropping it again. "No fangs," he continued, leaning close to peer at her mouth, and she could smell his breath, hot and metallic. "Blunt little teeth, meant for chewing plants and soft things." He stepped back and looked at the other Viraki, and then he began to laugh. It was not a pleasant sound, and it started deep in his chest and rumbled out like thunder, and one by one the other warriors joined in until the whole platform was shaking with their mockery. "The humans send us prey," Kethon said when the laughter finally died down, "and they call it diplomacy." Alara did not react, and she had known this would happen because she had read every cultural study and every intelligence report, and she understood that among the Viraki, respect was something you had to take, because it would never be given freely. So she simply stood there and waited for the laughter to stop, and when it did, she looked directly into Kethon's eyes, and she did not look away. "I am Commander Alara Vance," she said, and her voice was steady, "and I am here as the official liaison between Earth and the Viraki Dominion, and I look forward to working with you." Kethon's eyes narrowed slightly, and for just a moment something flickered across his face that might have been surprise, but then it was gone, and he turned away. "Take her to her quarters," he said over his shoulder to one of the younger warriors. "The servantier will do." The servantier was exactly what it sounded like, and Alara's room was small and windowless, and located in the lowest level of the citadel right next to the livestock pens, and the message was perfectly clear. She was not a guest, and she was not a colleague, and she was barely even worth noticing, but Alara had grown up on a farm in Montana where the winters could kill you if you made one wrong choice. And she had survived the Mars colony riots and the Neptune station disaster, and she had learned a long time ago that the universe did not care how you felt about things. So she unpacked her bag, and she made her bed, and she sat down at the small desk, and she began to write her first report back to Earth. "Initial contact successful," she wrote. "Cultural resistance as expected, but no immediate threats to safety, and will continue to observe and adapt." She did not mention the laughter or the contempt or the way they looked at her like she was something to be eaten. In the days that followed, Alara learned the rhythms of life in the Citadel, and she watched and she listened, and she began to understand things that were not in any of the briefing files. She learned that the Viraki valued strength above all else, and that their entire society was built on a hierarchy of predators, with the strongest at the top and the weakest at the bottom. She learned that they had never lost a war in their entire history, and that they had conquered 17 star systems through sheer force and brutality. She learned that they looked at humans the way a wolf might look at a rabbit, with a mixture of hunger and contempt and complete disbelief that such a weak species had ever made it to the stars. But Alara also noticed other things. She noticed that the Viraki warriors were easily bored, and that they often fought among themselves. Just to feel something, she noticed that they were impatient and quick to anger, and that they made decisions based on instinct rather than thought. She noticed that they had very little understanding of concepts like endurance or persistence or long-term planning, and she began to understand something, that the Viraki themselves did not seem to know humans were not predators in the way they understood. The word and humans were not built to chase down prey in short explosive bursts of speed and violence. Humans were something else entirely. Humans were persistence hunters, built to walk and walk until their prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. Humans were toolmakers who had learned to shape the world around them because their bodies were too weak to survive it otherwise. And most importantly, humans were pack bonders who would die for each other without hesitation and who formed connections so strong that nothing could break them. Alara knew that the Viraki did not understand any of this, and she knew that they would not understand it until they saw it with their own eyes. So she waited. She went to meetings where she was ignored, and she ate in the servant hall where the food was barely edible, and she walked through the citadel with her head held high while warriors laughed and made cool jokes about the fangless human. And every night she wrote her reports, and every night she reminded herself that she was not here to be liked. She was here to build a bridge between two worlds, and bridges take time. 3 weeks passed, and Alara began to wonder if anything would ever change. And then one night she was woken by alarms screaming through the citadel, and she knew without being told that everything was about to be different. The abandoned crash of the alarms woke everyone in the citadel, and Alara threw on her uniform and ran into the corridor where servants and warriors were rushing past her with panic in their eyes. She grabbed a young servant by the arm and asked what was happening, and his face was pale beneath his dark fur as he answered, "The orbital station," he said. "There has been an explosion, and something terrible has happened." Alara made her way to the main hall where a crowd had already gathered, and she pushed through the bodies until she could see the massive view screen that dominated the far wall. The images were terrible. The orbital station that hung above Kethros Prime was burning, and she could see huge sections of it that had been torn open by some kind of reactor malfunction, and debris was floating everywhere, and emergency pods were launching in all directions. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the small cluster of Viraki standing near the front of the crowd, their faces twisted with a kind of grief that Alara had never seen in them before. She recognized several of them as high nobles, the rulers of the great houses that controlled most of the Dominion's wealth and power, and they were weeping. What happened? Alara asked a guard standing nearby. The guard looked at her with something that might have been pity. "The royal creation was on that station," he said quietly. 12 cubs from the greatest families in the Dominion, and they were being raised there according to tradition. Alara felt her stomach drop. "The cubs," she said. "Are they dead?" The guard shook his head slowly. "The nursery module was jettisoned before the main explosion, and it is an emergency pod designed to survive atmospheric entry. Then they are safe." "No," the guard said, and his voice was heavy. "The pod crashed in the Thornlands, and no one survives the Thornlands." Alara had heard of the Thornlands, and she had seen images in the briefing files, and it was a region of the planet covered in forests of razor-sharp crystal formations that could slice through flesh like paper, and it was filled with venomous creatures and extreme temperature swings, and it was considered completely impassable, even by Viraki standards. Warlord Ketharn was standing at the front of the crowd, and his face was hard as stone. but Alara could see something in his eyes that looked almost like despair. How many caretakers survived the crash? He asked one of the officers. None, Warlord, the officer replied. They were all killed in the explosion before the module was jettisoned, and the cubs are alone. A terrible silence fell over the hall. Men, we must send a rescue party, one of the nobles said, his voice cracking with desperation. Kethan turned to face him, and his expression was grim. The Thornlands are 40 miles from the nearest safe zone, he said, and a rescue party would need to travel through crystal forests and venom swamps, and temperature extremes that would kill even our strongest warriors. But surely we must try. The noble pleaded. I sent a hunting party into the Thornlands once, Ketharn said quietly. 20 of my best warriors, and they made it less than 5 miles before. The land killed them all, and we never even found their bodies. He looked at the view screen where the crash pod was visible as a small blinking dot in a sea of deadly terrain. The cubs are already dead, he said. They simply do not know it yet. The noble let out a sound that was something between a howl and a sob, and other voices rose in grief and anger, and despair. Alara stood very still, and she looked at the map on the view screen, and she looked at the terrain data scrolling along the bottom, and she thought about 12 children alone and afraid, and waiting for help that would never come. And then she stepped forward. I will go. She said. Her voice was not loud, but somehow it cut through all the noise, and suddenly everyone was looking at Ketharn turned slowly, and his eyes narrowed as he stared at the small human woman standing before him. What did you say? I will go. Alara repeated. I will go to the Thornlands, and I will bring the cubs back. For a moment there was complete silence, and then the laughter started, just as it had on the landing platform 3 weeks ago. The fangless one wants to play hero. Someone shouted from the crowd. She will not last an hour. Another voice called out. Let her go. A third voice said. At least her death will be amusing. Ketharn raised a hand and the laughter stopped. He walked toward Alara until he was standing directly in front of her, and he looked down at her with an expression she could not read. You are serious, he said. Yes. You understand that you will die. I understand that I might die. Alara said, but those cubs will definitely die if no one tries to save them. Ketharn studied her for a long moment. Why? He asked finally. Why would you risk your life for Vuraki children when we have shown you nothing but contempt? Alara thought about the question, and she thought about all the reasons she could give. The diplomatic reasons and the strategic reasons and the political reasons, but in the end she just told the truth. Because they are children, she said. And they are scared and alone, and someone needs to help them, and I am the only one willing to try. Ketharn's expression flickered, and for just a moment she thought she saw something like respect in his eyes, but then it was gone. Very well, he said. You may go and die in the Thornlands if that is what you wish, and I will not stop you. He turned away and then paused and looked back at her. What supplies do you require? Alara had already made a mental list. A survival pack with water, purification equipment and emergency rations for 2 weeks, and a kinetic blade and a medical kit. That is all. That is all. Ketharn made a gesture, and one of the officers hurried away to gather the supplies. You leave at dawn, Ketharn said, and may whatever gods you humans believe in have mercy on you, because the Thornlands will not. Alara nodded and turned to leave. But before she could take a step, one of the grieving nobles stepped forward and grabbed her arm. His eyes were wet with tears, and his voice was barely a whisper. My daughter is on that pod, he said. Her name is Verakai, and she is only 3 years old, and she is afraid of the dark. He pressed something into Alara's hand, and she looked down and saw that it was a small glowing stone on a chain. This was her nightlight, he said. Please give it to her and tell her that her father loves her. Alara closed her fingers around the stone and felt its warmth against her palm. I will find her, she said, and I will bring her home. The noble's face crumpled, and he turned away unable to speak. Alara walked back to her quarters to prepare, and she did not sleep that night, and instead, she studied maps and planned routes and checked her equipment over and over again, and when the first light of dawn touched the horizon, she walked to the edge of the citadel, where the wilderness began. A small crowd had gathered to watch her leave. Mostly servants and a few warriors who wanted to see the foolish human begin her journey to death. Catherine was there too, and he said nothing as she passed, but he inclined his head slightly, and Alara chose to take it as a farewell, and she turned her face toward the distant line of crystal spires that marked the edge of the Thornlands, and she began to walk. What humans are the Thornlands tried to kill Alara within the first hour of her journey. Crystal formations rose around her like a forest of knives, and every step had to be calculated, because one wrong move would send her tumbling into edges sharp enough to cut through bone. The ground was covered in fine crystal dust that got into her eyes and her lungs and made every breath feel like swallowing broken glass, and the creatures came almost immediately. The first was something like a spider, but the size of a large dog with 8 legs covered in barbs and a mouth that dripped with venom, and it dropped from a crystal spire directly into her path and hissed at her with a sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe. Alara froze. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but she had read about these creatures in the briefing files, and she knew that running was exactly what they wanted. They were ambush predators built for short explosive attacks, and if she ran, they would chase her down in seconds. So, instead, she stood completely still and watched the creature circle her slowly, and its many eyes tracked her movements, and it was waiting for her to panic and give it a reason to attack. Alara counted her heartbeats and forced her breathing to stay slow and steady, and after what felt like an eternity, the creature seemed to lose interest, and it scuttled away into the crystal forest, looking for easier prey. She let out a shaky breath and continued walking. The first day was the hardest because her body was not yet adjusted to the constant strain, and by nightfall, she had already collected dozens of small cuts from crystal edges that she had not seen in time. She found a small hollow in a rock formation, and she crawled inside and treated her wounds with the medical kit and ate a small portion of her rations, and then she set her internal alarm for 15 minutes and closed her eyes. She did not allow herself to sleep deeply because deep sleep would make her vulnerable, and instead she drifted in a shallow doze that let her body rest while keeping part of her mind alert for danger. 15 minutes later, she woke and checked her surroundings, and when she was sure it was safe, she dozed again. This was how humans had survived on Earth for thousands of years before they had built walls and weapons, and this was the skill that had kept her ancestors alive when they were small and weak and surrounded by predators. The second day was worse. Temperature rose as the binary suns climbed into the sky, and the crystal formations reflected and amplified the heat, until the air itself seemed to burn. Alara wrapped cloth around her head and face and kept moving. Her water supply was running low, faster than she had expected, and she had to stop and use the purification equipment on a small pool of liquid that she found at the base of a crystal formation. Even though the liquid was murky and smelled like metal, she drank it anyway, because dehydration would kill her faster than poison. On the third day, she encountered a pack of the venom spitters. There were 6 of them, and they moved together in a coordinated hunting pattern, and Alara knew immediately that she could not fight them, and she could not outrun them, so she did something that no Viraki would ever have thought to do. She climbed. The crystal formations were sharp, but they were also tall, and Alara pulled herself up hand over hand, ignoring the cuts that opened on her palms and fingers, and she climbed until she was 20 feet above the ground. The venom spitters circled below her, and they spat streams of caustic liquid that sizzled against the crystals, but they could not climb, and after several hours, they gave up and moved. When Alara waited another hour just to be safe, and then she climbed down and kept walking by The fourth day, she had run out of bandages, and she was using strips torn from her own uniform to wrap her wounds. Her boots had been shredded by the crystal dust, and she had fashioned crude replacements from pieces of her survival pack. She was exhausted and hungry, and every part of her body hurt, but she did not stop. This was what humans were: not the fastest, and not the strongest, and not the most dangerous, but the most stubborn. Humans had chased prey across the African savanna for days at a time, walking and walking and walking until the animals they hunted simply collapsed from exhaustion. Humans had survived ice ages and famines and plagues and wars. Humans had looked at the cold emptiness of space and said, "We will go there anyway." And now this human was going to walk through the thornlands because there were children who needed her, and nothing was going to stop her on. The fifth day, she found the pod. It had crashed in a small clearing where the crystal formations had been shattered by the impact, and the metal hull was scorched and dented but intact. Alara approached slowly, and she could see small faces peering out through the viewport, and she could see the fear in their eyes. She stopped about 10 feet away and sat down on the ground. The cubs watched her through the window, and she could see them whispering to each other, and she knew that every instinct they had was telling them to be afraid of this strange creature that had appeared out of nowhere. So she did not approach, and she did not try to force her way inside. Instead, she opened her pack and took out the food and water she had rationed for herself, and she laid it out on the ground in front of her. Then she began to hum. It was an old song, a lullaby that her grandmother had sung to her when she was small and afraid, and the melody was soft and simple, and it filled the clearing with something that felt almost like peace. For a long time nothing happened. Then the door of the pod creaked open, and a small face appeared in the gap. It was the smallest of the cubs, a little female with fur that was more gray than black, and eyes that were huge and golden. She looked at Alara, and Alara looked at her, and neither of them moved. Then Alara reached into her pocket and pulled out the glowing stone that the noble had given her. "Varakai," she said softly, "your father wanted you to have this." The little cub's eyes went wide, and she let out a small sound that might have been a sob, and then she ran forward and threw herself into Alara's arms. Alara held her gently, and she could feel the small body trembling against her, and she stroked the soft fur and whispered words of comfort. One by one, the other cubs emerged from the pod. They gathered around Alara in a small circle, and they stared at her with a mixture of fear and wonder and hope. "Who are you?" asked the largest cub, a young male with proud bearing despite his obvious terror. "My name is Alara," she said, "and I have come to take you home." The cubs looked at each other and then looked back at her. "You have no fangs," the male said. "No." "Have no claws?" "No." "How will you protect us?" Alara looked at him, and she thought about all the ways she could answer that question. "I will walk in front of you," she said finally. "And anything that wants to hurt you will have to go through me first." The male cub studied her for a long moment. "That is not a very good plan," he said. Alara smiled. "It is the only plan I have," she said, "but I promise you this: I will not stop until you are safe, and I will not leave any of you behind, and I will not give up no matter what happens." The male cub tilted his head and considered her words. "You are very strange," he said. "I know," Alara replied. "Now come on and eat something because we have a long walk ahead of us." The long walk home, the journey back, was harder than the journey there in ways that Alara had not expected. 12 cubs meant 12 small bodies that tired quickly, and 12 sets of paws that were not built for walking on crystal ground, and 12 young minds that were terrified and confused and desperate for comfort. The smallest cubs could not walk for more than an hour without needing rest, and 2 of them had been injured in the crash and could barely walk at all. On the first morning, Alara fashioned slings from what remained of her uniform, and she strapped the injured cubs to her back and chest, and she carried them, even though the weight made every step twice as hard. The largest cub was named Verkan, and he was the son of one of the great house lords, and he walked at the front of the group as if he were leading them, even though he had no idea where he was going. Was proud and stubborn, and he reminded Alara of herself when she was young. "Why do you carry the weak ones?" he asked her on the second day. "They slow us down and make us easier targets." Alara did not stop walking as she answered, "Because they cannot walk on their own. In the Dominion the weak are left behind." Verkan said, "It is the way of things. It is not my way." Alara said simply. Vorkan was quiet for a while after that. The predators came on the second night. Alara heard them before she saw them. A rustling in the crystal forest that was too deliberate to be wind, and she gathered the cubs behind her and drew her kinetic blade and waited. There were 3 of them. Creatures that looked like a cross between wolves and lizards, with scales that glittered in the moonlight and eyes that glowed with hunger. They circled the small group slowly, and Alara could see them testing for weakness and looking for the best angle of attack. "Stay behind me," she told the cubs, "and do not run no matter what happens." The first creature lunged, and Alara met it with her blade, and the kinetic energy tore through its shoulder and sent it spinning away with a howl of pain. The second creature came from the side, and Alara barely managed to turn in time, and she felt claws rake across her arm as she drove the blade into its chest. The third creature hesitated, and Alara used that moment to make herself look as large as possible, and she screamed at it with all the fury she could muster, and she waved the bloody blade as she made herself look like something that was more trouble than it was worth. The creature backed away slowly, and then turned and fled into the darkness and its wounded companions. Followed. Alara stood there for a long moment with blood dripping from her arm and her heart pounding in her chest. Then she felt something press against her leg, and she looked down and saw little Varakai looking up at her with huge eyes. "You are hurt," the cub said. "I am fine," Alara said. "You are lying," Varakai said. "I can smell the blood." Alara laughed despite herself, and it hurt, but she could not help it. "Okay," she admitted. "I am a little hurt, but I will be okay, and we need to keep moving." She bandaged her arm as best she could, and they continued walking. On the third day, Alara began to notice something strange. The cubs had stopped walking behind her. Instead, they walked around her in a loose circle, with the older cubs on the outside and the younger cubs on the inside, and when they rested, they gathered close to her and pressed against her, as if seeking warmth. Even Verkan, who had been so proud and distant, was staying close to her now. "What are you doing?" she asked him. Verkan looked embarrassed, which was an odd expression on his fierce young face. "We are protecting you," he said. "Protecting me? You are injured and tired," he said, "and you have given us all of your food, and you have carried the little ones even when it hurt you." He paused and seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say. "My father taught me that a leader is the strongest and the fastest and the most dangerous," he said finally. "But you are none of those things, and yet you have not stopped, and you have not left us behind, and you have put yourself between us and every threat." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on a Veraki face before. "I think maybe my father was wrong about what makes a leader." Alara did not know what to say, so she just kept walking. But that night when they stopped to rest, Verkan came and sat beside her, and he pressed his small shoulder against her leg in a gesture that she recognized from the cultural briefings as the highest form of respect among the Vorakiat. Was the gesture of pack bonding, and it meant that he was acknowledging her as his alpha. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "You are our alpha now," Verkan said simply. "You have earned it." One by one, the other cubs came and did the same thing, and by the time the last one had pressed against her, Alara had tears running down her face. "I am not your alpha," she said. "I am just a human with no fangs and no claws." "You are our alpha," Varakai said firmly, "and we will fight anyone who says otherwise." Alara looked at the 12 small faces gathered around her, and she saw something in their eyes that she had never expected to see: trust and love and absolute loyalty. And she understood then that she had been wrong about herself. She had thought that she was weak because she did not have weapons built into her body. But weapons were not what made someone strong. What made someone strong was the willingness to keep going when everything hurt, and to protect others, even when it cost you everything, and to love without any thought of what you might get in return. "Okay," she said quietly. "I will be your alpha, but that means you have to do what I say." "What do you say?" Verkin asked. "I say we rest now and walk at dawn, and we do not stop until we reach the citadel." The cubs nodded solemnly, and they curled up around her in a pile of warm fur and soft breathing, and Alara sat awake watching over them until the first light touched the sky. They walked for 2 more days. Alara was running on nothing but willpower by the end, and her vision was blurry, and her legs felt like they were made of stone, and every step was an act of pure determination. But she did not stop. She could not stop, because 12 cubs were counting on her, and she had promised to bring them home on the morning of the 5th day. They finally emerged from the Thornlands, and the crystal forest gave way to open plains, and in the distance, Alara could see the walls of the citadel gleaming in the sunlight. She stopped and stared at it for a long moment, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not even realized was tight. "We made it," she said. The cubs gathered around her, and they looked at the citadel, and then they looked at her. "You made it," Verkin corrected her. "We just followed." Alara smiled and put her hand on his head. "That is what Pack does," she said. "We follow each other." And together they walked toward home. The fangless alpha, the guards on the wall, saw them. First a shout went up, and then another, and within minutes the entire citadel seemed to be rushing toward the main gate. Alara walked slowly because her body had nothing left to give, and the cubs walked with her in their protective formation, with the older ones on the outside and the younger ones pressed close to her sides. She could see the crowd gathering ahead of her, and she could see the expressions on their faces changing as they realized what they were looking at. 12 cubs who should have been dead were walking out of the Thornlands, and they were being led by the fangless human who everyone had mocked and dismissed. Warlord Catharn pushed his way to the front of the crowd, and he stopped and stared at Alara with an expression she could not read. His eyes moved over her body, and she knew what he was seeing. Her uniform was gone and replaced by makeshift bandages and scraps of fabric, and her skin was covered in cuts and bruises and dry blood, and she was thin and pale, and she could barely stand, but she was standing, and behind her were 12 living, breathing cubs. "What is this?" Catharn said, and his voice was strange and quiet. Before Alara could answer, Verkin stepped forward, and his young voice rang out clear and strong across the silent crowd. "She is Pack Mother," he said. "She is Alpha, and any who challenge her will answer to us." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Alara saw shock and confusion on the faces of the warriors. "A human cannot be Alpha," someone called out. "It is against all tradition. She earned it," Verkin said fiercely. "She walked through the Thornlands alone to find us, and she carried the wounded ones on her back, and she fought predators with nothing but a blade, and she gave us all of her food and water, and she did not stop even when she was bleeding and broken." His voice rose with every word. "She is more Alpha than anyone I have ever known, and I do not care about your traditions." Little Varakai stepped forward and pressed herself against Alara's leg. "She is our Alpha," she said in her small voice, "and we love her." One by one, the other cubs did the same thing until all 12 of them were clustered around Alara in a wall of fur and fangs and fierce protective love. The crowd fell completely silent. Catherine looked at Alara for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, the old warlord lowered himself to one knee. It was a gesture of respect that Alara had never seen a Varaki make, and she could hear gasps of shock from the crowd around them. I have lived for 200 years. Ketharn said quietly, and I have fought in 100 wars, and I have killed more enemies than I can count, and I thought I understood what strength was. He looked up at her, and his ancient eyes were wet with something that might have been tears. I was wrong. He stood slowly and faced the crowd. I sent my best hunting party into the Thornlands once, he said. 20 of my finest warriors, and they lasted less than a day, and none of them came back. He turned and looked at Alara. This human walked through that same land alone, and she survived for 5 days, and then she walked back out with 12 cubs, and she did it with no fangs and no claws and no venom. His voice grew stronger. She did it with nothing but her own stubborn refusal to give up, and her own love for children, who were not even her own species. He turned back to the crowd. We called her prey because she had no natural weapons, but we were fools, and we did not understand what humans truly are. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with something that sounded almost like wonder. They are not predators, and they are not prey, and they are something else entirely. He looked at Alara. They are shepherds, and they guard the flock, even when the wolves come. And they do not stop even when it costs them everything. He lowered his head. I have been a wolf my entire life, and I thought that made me strong, but I see now that I was wrong, and true strength is not about fangs and claws, and true strength is about love. The crowd was completely silent, and Alara could see the expressions on their faces, changing as they processed what they had seen and heard then. A voice called out from the back. What happens now? Ketharn turned to face Alara. That is up to the Alpha. He said. Alara looked at him, and then looked at the crowd, and then looked down at the 12 cubs who were still pressed against her, as if they never intended to let go. She was exhausted, and she was hurt, and all she really wanted was to sleep. For about a week, but she was also a diplomat, and she knew an opportunity. When she saw one, I came here to build a bridge between our peoples, she said, and her voice was rough but steady, and I think maybe I have started that process. She looked at Ketharn. I would like better quarters, she said, and a seat on the War Council, and perhaps some medical attention if that is not too much trouble. Ketharn laughed, and it was a real laugh, warm and surprised and genuine. You will have the Alpha Suite, he said, and a seat on the council and the finest healers in the Dominion. He glanced at the cubs who were still growling softly at anyone who came too close to their human, and a rather formidable honor guard, it seems. Alara smiled despite her exhaustion. They are good kids, she said. They are, Ketharn agreed, and they have chosen well. The crowd began to part as Alara walked toward the citadel, and the cubs walked with her. And no one laughed and no one mocked, and every Varaki she passed lowered their head in respect. When she reached the entrance, she stopped and turned back to face the crowd one last time. I have learned something during my time here, she said, and I have learned that strength comes in many forms and that the universe is full of wonders that we do not yet understand. She looked at Ketharn. My people have a saying, she said, that it is not the size of the dog in the fight that matters, but the size of the fight in the dog. She smiled. I think there is room in this galaxy for wolves and shepherds both, and I think that together we might be able to build something extraordinary. Ketharn nodded slowly. I think you may be right, he said. Alara turned and walked into the citadel with her pack of cubs following close behind her. The years that followed the Human-Varaki alliance would grow to become one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, and historians would write books about how it began. They would write about the treaties and the trade agreements and the military victories, but those who had been there on that day at the gates would tell a different story. They would tell the story of a fangless human who walked into hell to save 12 children who were not her own. And they would tell the story of how those children had looked at all the fangs and claws in the universe and had chosen to follow the one creature who had none, because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not the sharpest weapon. Sometimes It is the heart that refuses to quit, and that is what humans are.